Good evening, everybody. I want to say it's wonderful to be with you. It is, but many of us wish we were in Jerusalem tonight. But we are so unbelievably thrilled that Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is here. Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of Shalom Hartman Institute and a leading thinker and author on the major challenges facing the Jewish people. He's the author of Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past, the co-editor of the New Jewish Canon, and the host of the Identity Crisis podcast, which I know all of us have listened to religiously over these past 2 years. The past 12 days have been unbelievably shaking, and we were talking about this earlier, just the multiple realities that American Jews are facing, that Israelis are facing, that now there's a potential for a new Middle East. There's hope, there's fear, there's courage, there's exhaustion, and there's still a war going on in Gaza, and there's still 50 hostages that need to come home. And so to say that these are complex times is a deep understatement. And part of the way we do this as Jews to figure out where we are and where we're going is to talk. We are a people of the book, and actually having conversation and talking about identity and how all of these issues impact who we are as Jews, as American Jews, as Jews who care desperately about Israel. There's no better way to do this than, in my view, being in conversation in the 21st century with the Hartman Institute. So I want to thank you, Yehuda, for being here and for all that you do in the world for our people and for our congregation. So welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's a little strange to be back here again the second time this year, actually, right? That was this year? Yeah, that was this year. I think it was in November. I didn't expect to be back here this year, and at the same time, I did expect to be with a lot of you in Jerusalem. So there's a lot that's very strange about this. I've lost track of time in the last few weeks, and in particular, hadn't fully realized until I was on the train that tonight was the first night of the program that we were supposed to have in Jerusalem, and tomorrow would have been a day when I gave my talk at Hartman on a totally different topic. So there's a lot of whiplash and a sense of confusion in relationship to time. And apropos the introduction that you shared, and I appreciate it, I want to start by talking about time and the experience of living through such a complicated, in this case, very complicated 12 days or 14 days or however long it's been within the context of a very complicated 21 months. There are two legendary Talmudic narratives that are told about rabbis who time travel. Two stories that the rabbis tell about time travel. They don't have time machines. That would be great if they did. But they were onto the idea of time travel as a way of understanding what it might feel like or what it looks like to take seriously how the world changes over time. And the myth or the fantasy of time travel is to get to see something that you can't possibly imagine in your future from the place that you sit. One story imagines Moses sitting in the back of the study hall of Rabbi Akiva, nearly a millennium after Moses had received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and bewildered as this sage in Jewish tradition, Rabbi Akiva, is expounding and expanding the meaning of Torah into ways that Moses could not have imagined. In fact, the text says his strength weakened because somehow he felt that the fact that this person 800 years later was able to massage meaning out of a Torah that Moses himself didn't understand made him feel lesser, made him feel inferior in that situation. The second great rabbinic story about time travel tells the story of Choni, who was kind of not really a rabbi, he was kind of like a strange, miracle-working holy man, who is Judaism's Rip Van Winkle. He falls asleep in a cave for 70 years and awakens to find himself completely out of place. in a world that he fundamentally recognizes. He hasn't journeyed physically to anywhere else. But 70 years means in the rabbinic imagination that anyone who was alive when you were alive is now no longer alive. You're at a different epoch in Jewish history. You've passed generations. They remember Choni. The people know him. His legacy is secure, but he doesn't know them and they don't know him. In fact, he's so strange that they don't believe that he is in fact Choni. Nobody recognizes him and he dies alone. Our tradition in telling stories like this recognizes something about the passage of time, which is that our tradition, curated over thousands of years, is very comfortable with the notion of moving through history slowly. That process makes sense. And when you move through history relatively slowly, something magical can happen, which is that our capacity to interpret Judaism, and in fact to change Judaism over time, is actually electric. We know that Judaism 500 years ago bears no resemblance to our Judaism of today. We know that a Jew from 200 years ago who would walk into a congregation like this wouldn't recognize it as being part of our religion, even though we look backwards in time and see ourselves as the inheritors of the Judaism that those before us paved the way for what it is that we do. Judaism can change in ways that feel imperceptible as you live through those changes. Sometimes you can notice by the end of your life that things are quite different than they were at the beginning of your life, but most of the day-to-day or year-to-year experience enables us to feel as though the movement through time is relatively imperceptible, but those changes can seem radical with the benefit of historical hindsight. Now, of course, the Jewish people have lived through other turbulent periods of time. In fact, perhaps the most turbulent period in our history, a stretch of 15 years between 1933 and 1948, when our people witnessed the lowest point of our vulnerability and our powerlessness, the most intense period of our suffering, culminating with a period of the emergence of the greatest Jewish power the Jewish people have held in 2,000 years. And what I can only remember in stories from ancestors, usually second-hand and third-hand told, a kind of euphoria that would have been unprecedented for most of the Jewish history that preceded it, but certainly for the experience of Jews throughout Europe in the 1815 preceding years. For most of us alive today, I can speak about this as my own experience. The thing that the last couple of years is signaling to me, and I go back now even 5 years. It's been 5 years of massive disruption. But certainly on the Jewish front and in the relationship to Israel front, the events of the past 2 years, which have felt relentless in the stories and sequences of the changing attitudes about Israel in the world, Israel's behavior both as victim and then as respondent to its threats, have been so significantly turbulent that it's starting to make me feel that maybe the period of time in which I grew up, in which, like, nothing really happened, maybe that stretch was the outlier in terms of history, and part of what we are experiencing may bear greater resemblance to what many humans experience throughout history, which is a familiarity with rupture, political violence, and war in ways that maybe I was simply blessed to not have to live with most of my life, but should start getting used to as the norm of what it means to be a Jew at this point in history. Maybe it actually would be a useful adaptation to think not of turmoil not as something profoundly disruptive and countercultural, but the norm. Maybe doing so would actually be more useful to us psychologically in not feeling, as I have felt, reeling by every one of these turn of events, that like I'm literally checking the news in the middle of the night. Like I wake up and check the news in the middle of the night because I don't want to have missed something. My own Shabbat practice has changed since October 7th, that I will not be for 25 hours without knowing what's happening in the news. A disruption in time, not just the overarching narrative of time, but even the lived experience of our holy liturgical sacred time. It's interesting, and maybe interesting is not the right word. It's very, very complicated to watch that these sequence of events, even over the past few weeks, building on the traumas of the last couple of years, seeing them back to back, and noticing the diverse expressions, the different types of responses that I see in my feeds and in my relationships. I was speaking to a smaller group earlier, the different kinds of ways in which Israelis appear to be processing the war with Iran, and many American Jews seem to be processing it. Israelis processing it with the immediate experience of living in intense vulnerability and running to bomb shelters, combined with a strange euphoria of feeling as though the world has completely opened. There's a future possibility of a Middle East that they could not have anticipated, where their principal enemy, the anchor of a lot of the hatred against them, now appears to have been eviscerated, with a possibility now of new relationships with other countries waiting for the process of normalization. Maybe this could all get tied up into a bow, versus the American Jewish experience, where American Jews who feel attached and connected to Israel feel a sense of visceral pain and fear without access to the direct experience of having agency to respond to this story, to be actually fighting against it, or running to a bomb shelter, or building communities and cultures of care for those in our midst, and therefore feeling what I have seen for the last several weeks in the American Jewish community, an incredible heaviness and a sense of deep despair, that all of these are trauma responses. Maybe it's a gift to ourselves to note of these that they are trauma responses. Because when you think of things as perfectly rational expressions that respond to the world and its stimuli, then you can be really judgmental of who's getting it right and who's getting it wrong. And maybe one gift that we can offer ourselves is that we notice in a period like this that all of our rapid reactions, those feelings of fear and isolation and alienation, anxiety that perhaps our electeds are not getting it right in their response, the instinctual desire to see all of these events as explainable through previously existing narratives. This is a bad war because it's launched by a president and a prime minister I don't like. This is a good war because of the outcomes that it's created that I couldn't anticipate. That the speed by which we are formulating these responses are indicative not of having figured out things fully, but actually because we are sitting with an immense amount of trauma as a people, and we are yielding these as visceral responses that emanate not from our full understanding of these issues, but from that experience of trauma itself. I've been speaking with a rabbi recently a lot. We traded messages on social media, and she expressed her kind of confusion about why it is that people don't fully get certain things about what's happening in the news. I mean, welcome to human civilization. But one of the back and forths that we had is that it may not be possible for human beings to assimilate the amount of information and stimuli from the news that we are experiencing, that we are the first humans in history. With access to this much information, it's not just that we get diverse presentations of news and can't make sense of it. It's not merely that we gravitate with our biases towards news that affirms our hypotheses and against news sources that challenge us because of the theory of cognitive dissonance. It's not just those things. It's just that maybe our brains aren't fully capable of absorbing news and events in the speed that they are now made possible to us. In previous eras of Jewish history, if you would learn about the trauma that the Jewish people were experiencing somewhere else, you didn't hear about it in real time. It was mediated slowly, and that brings its own pain, its own sense of helplessness or powerlessness to be able to confront it. But we are the first in generations of Jewish history to feel tethered to other Jews and their experiences as though we are Jews in any other time in Jewish history through these bonds of relationship, but being assaulted in our senses about the need to assimilate that information, interpret it, make meaning from it, and then process it into our daily Jewish lives. Trauma, as we know, limits our choices. Trauma forces us to respond in ways that feel like they are not responses. They are visceral responses, automatic responses. The reason we go to therapy is because therapy enables us to disconnect between the traumatic event and the obligations in our behaviors, in our consciousness, in our memory, in our imagination that are been forced upon us by those type of traumatic events. When you can disconnect them, when you can understand the trauma for what it is, and give yourself back the ability to then think about who you are, what you believe, and what you want to do, you are healed from the commanding force that a trauma can have on your consciousness. But what does it look like for a people to be experiencing this amount of trauma in real time, and for us to not be processing it as one people, but as thousands, if not millions of people who are experiencing these traumas in our own particular ways? But even if you don't want to pathologize the experience of these last couple of weeks or these last couple of years, the crisis that we face may not have to be a story of trauma with all of its implications medically and psychologically. We can at least describe the situation we find ourselves in as a crisis of uncertainty. How many of you have found yourself over the last couple of weeks being like, this happened, good news? Good news? or that seems terrible. Or is it? Right? How do you find a way out of that uncertainty? What we try to do is we gravitate instinctively towards the sources of trust in our knowledge that might give us tools or shortcuts to evaluate whether when something happens, it is good or bad. Right? So the shortcut might be, I don't like anything the President of the United States does. Therefore, this declaration of war and the bombing of a nuclear enrichment site in Iran must be something that is bad. That's a good way to shortcut the question of uncertainty, right? I don't have to process it on its face. I find a shortcut. Or it might be, for many who operate in the Jewish community, I give the State of Israel, the IDF, the Mossad, the intelligence services, the benefit of the doubt. So I'm willing to say, right, in the fog of war, and that's what we're living in, the fog of war, in that period of that fog, I'm willing to say, I trust that this is probably the right decision, even though I feel uncertain about it. I look to my elected officials. Who instinctively likes it and who doesn't like it? Maybe that tells a story. What version of the news do I continue to look at, and which do I walk away from? Over the last 36 hours, totally competing stories about the effectiveness of Israel's strikes have emerged onto national media, and all of us are left to basically make choices about which story we want to trust and which one we choose to be uncertain about. By the way, we're completely aware of the costs of that choice. If you believe the story in the New York Times and in CNN that the US failed to actually destroy the nuclear enrichment plant at Fordo, that all it did was essentially seal the entrance and set back Iran's nuclear project by a matter of months rather than years or decades, as the Trump administration and the Israelis are claiming, the choice to believe that story is to put yourself back into a period of tremendous anxiety and uncertainty about the future of Iran's nuclear program, and to now build in a question of whether American assault on the region was worthwhile. The choice, in reverse, to say, no, I believe the story from Israeli intelligence and American sources that this is destroyed, is now I can breathe easier. So the crisis of uncertainty is not just a kind of a factual experience of living with these two various options and not knowing which one to trust, but it is connected to a whole set of ideological preconditions and ideological results and experiential results that emerge on the other end as a result of these choices. And here's what I have to offer tonight, which is not going to be deep analysis of uranium enrichment. It's not. It's not. It's the wrong place. I am the third most qualified member of my immediate family to speak with expertise about the future of Israel's negotiations with its regional neighbors. The third in my most immediate family. It is a very humbling experience in our family's WhatsApp group, possibly the fourth, actually. And I think about all of the various, this is like a family business, and I opted out of the family business. Instead, the question I want to ask tonight, the one that I go back to, that our institution goes back to all the time, which says, what Torah is available to us to wrestle with this moment in Jewish history? What Torah is available to us to help think about these 20 months of war, of human rights, of humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the rise of anti-Semitism here in America, the renegotiation of Israel in the world stage, both negatively throughout the war in Gaza, and in some ways positively in major countries in the West in terms of its willingness to take on Iran alone. This further war, maybe it's the same war, maybe it's a different war, which changes Israel's future, the continuation of the war in Gaza as this goes, the relationship between the US and Israel, and what that means for American Jews. All of this rapid change, all of this stuff that creates this sense of trauma and uncertainty, what Torah is available to us, or are we obligated to build in order to make our way through this moment in Jewish history? I've been feeling over the last couple weeks, but especially over the last couple of days, something I haven't fully felt before, especially as someone who is connected to an institution that believes that there is something called the Jewish people. It's not merely an abstraction, that we are a nation, a people that's divided geographically but shares some collective and shared project, that there are actually the need right now for what may feel like two different Torahs for the Jewish people in this moment, one that Israelis need to develop, and one that we as American Jews are going to need to develop. The Torah that Israelis are going to have to develop is a Torah for what feels like it is becoming, in Israel, a warrior people. Israelis have spent the last several years, but really the last 76, engaged in some version of being at war. But it would be reasonable to conclude from the years following the Second Intifada until October 7th that with the exception of a couple of what now look in retrospect like skirmishes, that something had shifted in the Israeli psyche and Israeli consciousness. We had seen the rise of all forms of new expressions of Jewish spirituality in Israel over the last 20 years. Almost seemed as though it was like we kind of got over the mountain of the narrative of Israel at perpetual war, and we're beginning to have to excavate all of the questions that then resulted for the state of Israel about what its character and identity would have looked like, where it has become inevitable prior to October 7th that something was going to have to give in the relationship between Israeli Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, that something was going to have to change and give around democracy in Israel as evidenced by the democratic protests in the entire 2023, but especially the summer, that something was going to have to change around questions of religious pluralism for a Jewish identity in Israel that was as multicolor and multivalent as our Jewish diversity here in America, that was going to be part of the new story. And what it appears to now be is that for the past 2 years, Israelis have re-entered warrior mode. This is my family and friends. My nephew spends his bulk of his time studying for rabbinic ordination. He's got 2 little kids at home, 2 babies, one of whom has been alive for about a year, and about 9 to 10 months of that year he has spent in Gaza. There were long stretches of time, this was like unbelievable, where my nephew Shlomo managed, there was downtime in Gaza, and he didn't have little babies, and he managed to pass one of his rabbinic ordination exams in Gaza. When you spend that much time at war, it is inevitable that a whole generation of young Israelis are going to feel that their primary identity is that of warriors. When you have a country that even after 20 months is then pulled into what is essentially a conventional war over the past 2 weeks, anything that is fought in Gaza is an unconventional war, but now pulled into a conventional war for 2 weeks, that even not just the suffering or the feeling of suffering of being called into duty or hiding in a bomb shelter, right? But the experience of feeling engaged with and responsible, the euphoria that has emerged for many Israelis about what they feel is the future of that region, all of that is tied into an Israeli Jewish identity that feels more and more like the identity of a warrior people. And within that, right, what could emerge as a language or a Torah for a warrior people are a whole variety of dangerous ideas. Ideas that could be sourced from our tradition that find currency in the messianic. It's so interesting to me. Israelis who were not lefties were very allergic to the lefty language connected to Shimon Peres around the Oslo process about a new Middle East. Do you know why? They considered it to be fantasy land. They talked about it as being messianic. And now it's totally switched. It's the Israeli right that is enamored by the language of the new Middle East. Now, not because Israel lives at harmony with its neighbors, but because Israel has achieved regional superiority and can now pave the way towards normalization agreements that are not about sacrifices Israel has to make, but about shared interests that are newly possible. There's a risk in the morality of a warrior people, and this is a profound issue under this administration in America and its moral choices, but it is deeply at play in wars like this, of a morality that conflates means and ends. This is the most dangerous kind of morality, a morality that claims that because an end is just, it makes legitimate any exercise you undertake in pursuit of that end. Doesn't matter what you do, as long as the outcome was successful, then it was a legitimate process. Where I was queasy when America attacked Iran was not because I think that the Iranian nuclear enrichment plants should exist. I thought the German chancellor said this quite well. There's no peaceful project around nuclear enrichment that is possible when you place all of your work 100 meters underground. That is not what this is about. But I did worry, as a liberal Democrat, that the choice not to engage Congress, the choice not to go through the democratic processes around a declaration of war, was a choice to choose ends and to reject means. And the erosion of democracy that is very prominent in this country is about the choice of ends, and this is true on the far left as much as it does on the right, any means necessary to pursue those ends. And that, too, is a dangerous morality that can emerge for Israeli society. And there continues to be something more basic in the Torah that Israelis are going to need if they are going to remain a warrior people. And that is a problem diagnosed years ago by Professor Michael Walzer, who said that the Jewish people have a Torah on a lot of things, but the one thing we don't really have Torah on is war. And why is that? Of course, you have plenty of stuff in the Jewish tradition, like from the book of Joshua, parenthetically, do not use. Not our people's best work. Do not use, right? I have all of this stuff, and I have rabbis throughout Jewish tradition who talk about a Torah of war, but what makes Jewish law work throughout Jewish history is not theoretical discussions, it's case law. It's responsa. It's situations in which we were in that we could then evaluate afterwards what worked and what didn't work. It's true about any other Jewish practice, and it should be true about war also. So when Walzer said the Jewish people don't have a Torah of war, he was expressing concern that we were going to be the first generation of Jews writing a Torah for this period in Jewish history. And we have made progress. There are now dozens and dozens of works of responsa in modern Israel about what it means to fight a Jewish war justly and ethically. But as the terms are changing so quickly, as the technology is changing so quickly, as the fantasy of outcomes that were not imaginable beforehand are changing so quickly, it's not clear that we continue to have a Torah of warriors that the state of Israel is going to fully need. Israel seems to be sitting at a precipice of a new version of itself in the need of a kind of cloak of wisdom. But we as American Jews have a very different need of Torah right now. It's not just that we need Israel to figure out what's the Torah of warriors. And it's very, very concerning to see the story of simultaneously of extraordinary Israeli military success in one part of the Middle East and Israel trying and failing to manage a humanitarian catastrophe that it has brought about in another corner of the Middle East, and to notice the paucity of Torah that we have to make sense of both of these stories and to guide ethically the Jewish people through this moment. But if Israel struggles with a Torah of warriors right now, I think we here in the diaspora need a different Torah, which is a Torah for warriors. Our experience here is not one of being warriors. I find it so nauseating, so awful, when people turn college students into warriors for Israel on campus. No, they are not. They are students going to college who have complicated and ambivalent feelings about the Jewish people and about liberal values and about the state of Israel and about war. They are not warriors, and nothing that we can say can attach, there's no rhetorical value or power in describing that way, except that maybe it appeals to some inferiority complex that some American Jews have about the fact that we are not ourselves warriors. But in turn, by being not actual warriors on the front line in Israel, it means that we American Jews hold a tremendous amount of the same trauma and anxiety that other of the Jewish people hold, but with minimal agency to do anything about it. Something very dark and powerful about watching my friends send their kids off to war, many of whom are profound critics of the government of Israel and continue to be profound critics of this war. But they feel that is part of what happens as a citizen in a democracy. You raise your voice one day, and you send your kid off the next day. And here, what do we have? We have a lot of the fear about what's taken place in Israel in the last 2 weeks. In previous eras of tremendous fear, I got on a plane. Couldn't do that. It was a big deal for me, personally, that I was able to be in Israel on October 15th, 2023, because I happened to have had a plane ticket, and the skies weren't closed. So I could do what we do as Jews when other Jews are in a period of suffering. I'm not going to go fight, but I could pay Shiva calls. I could babysit my great-nephews and great-nieces while their father goes off to war. I could do those things, right? I could, pack socks, right? You could do something. Part of what is so difficult, I think, about the last 2 weeks was this the state of Israel may be about to engage in catastrophic, possibly nuclear war with its enemies, and all I got is refresh the Times of Israel page. That's all I got. So what do I need to do to be able to emerge spiritually whole from that kind of experience? I guess I'm going to share a simple idea, which is what I feel like I have been struggling with and what I've just described is a sense of a loss of agency. And I think the simple idea I want to argue for today is that a Torah for warriors has to be rooted in a desire to reclaim a sense of agency about whatever it is that we have control over. A commitment to decide to be in history as an affirmative choice rather than to merely suffer it. a commitment to what are the ideas and ideals that we, as the Jewish people in America, think we are building, as opposed to what is the experience of history in which we think we are being washed over. There are certainly dimensions of the story of the implication of the wars in Israel on American Jewish identity over which we as American Jews continue to have control. I felt whiplash by these events as though something was going to change in the world and then my identity was going to be different. If this person wins this election, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm going to do what I've always done, which is be a passionate citizen who tries to work for the advancement of my country, and sometimes I'm on the losing side of those elections, and sometimes I'm on the winning side. And either side that you're on, it doesn't exonerate you of your democratic responsibilities to show up the way that you're supposed to show up in the world. And to figure out whether there is a way for the Jewish people to reclaim a kind of constructive optimism for a period like this, which is a way of responding to the culture of uncertainty that we face. Constructive optimism is not euphoric belief that there is a new Middle East. It's dangerous for Israelis. It's dangerous for American Jews as well. I couldn't believe some of the breathless commentary on social media and elsewhere. Like, what? When has this worked out that well? When has this happened so quickly that you channel this belief that actually our tradition in the Bible says the worst thing you can do in a period where you're winning is to claim bekochi uve'otzem yadi, through my own power, through the strength of my hand, I brought this about. That is the worst thing you can do, because then you know who ultimately is going to hold you accountable for that? God, who's like, this was not you at all. So there was something so strange to me about those who are so passionate about Israel and its accomplishments that it felt so deeply divorced from that culture of responsibility that lies at the heart of the Jewish tradition. And here's where Jewish ethics comes into play. Jewish ethics, I think, ultimately are about the recognition that we have as Jews that we have agency. I think that's the underlying idea behind all of Jewish ethics. And here there are, I think, two core Jewish ethical ideas that could help us in this moment. One is the idea at the heart of rabbinic tradition. It's there in the Bible, but the rabbis make it important, that human beings are created in the image of God, and that gives us agency and power and responsibility in the world. Jewish ethics takes as its starting point the legitimacy and the right of self-defense. It takes as its position that you are responsible to go out into the world and to improve it, not to hide in your quietest places, not to defer responsibility and power to others, but to take your dignity and your power seriously. And what an incredible thing for us as this period of Jewish history, these last 2 weeks, to see that on display. That Jews would say, not on my watch am I going to experience my own demise. That is a Jewish ethical principle. But the twin side of that ethical principle is to then ask, how do I extend all of the power that I attach to myself in my obligations and my responsibilities to others? First, through the principle that which I wish for myself, I'm willing to give to others, I am obligated to give to others. And then even more powerfully, the biblical obligation that you are not allowed to stand idly by, either on the blood of your fellow or when you see even the property of your fellow suffering, you cannot ever claim you didn't see. Now, the powerful thing is that as ethical principles, these are sometimes weaponized against each other in Jewish political discourse. Those who claim the moral legitimacy of the right to self, the right to dignity, the right to power, oftentimes, tragically, stop there. They can't see that extending that to others is anything less than some receding or granting of the right to self that is somehow going to undermine me. And there are plenty of those in the Jewish world who are so passionately committed to the morality of not standing idly by at the suffering of others that they cannot take seriously the dignity and the morality of self-preservation and of survival. We are witnessing in a week both of these stories in real time. What does it look like for us to fully embrace the possibility that there are aspects of what has been made possible in the last 2 weeks that reflect a version of the Jewish people's attainment of dignity in a way that hasn't been seen before? When the German chancellor, again, not what I quoted him saying last time, but what he said the first time, where he said, it's unbelievable. He said some version of, it's incredible that Israel is doing for us what we didn't do for ourselves. Unbelievable. When in Jewish history have we been able to say this? And to see this happen while the war in Gaza continues means that we are holding both of these ethical precepts at the same time. And both of them are rooted in agency. A Jew today who looks at the story of the accomplishment of Israelis in Iran and feels a sense of appreciation for agency has now made themselves liable to express that agency everywhere else. If you want to claim that you are merely a victim, a passive sufferer of history, plenty of Jews made that argument throughout Jewish history. Those people were ethically pristine. They were sufferers of history. It never really worked in their favor, and they were never fully accountable to have to be carriers of an ethics that went beyond the ethics of survival. But if you are going to be a Jew today who feels a sense of pride at the accomplishments of the state of Israel, you then take onto yourself the responsibility to feel a sense of obligation to those pieces of what the state of Israel and the Jewish people can do in the world where the work is profoundly unfinished. It cannot be that these two things can exist at the same time, one of which obligates us and one of which doesn't. And the flip side is true also. If you believe that all of the power lies in the state of Israel to resolve the situation in Gaza, to take full responsibility for the humanitarian catastrophe, to end the war unilaterally, you've got to figure out a way to express a narrative of ethical responsibility that also embraces what that story tells you about the state of Israel's accomplishments and those of the Jewish people on the global stage. I feel like the biggest mistake we could make in a period like this is to get back to that feeling that we are merely passive agents in a history that is washing over us. And I look at the last few weeks, and I do feel a sense of pride at Israel's accomplishments in Iran. I did a podcast that released this morning with my dad. He's first on the list of family members who have expertise on this thing. And I pushed him at one point. I was like, I know that people have a lot of opinions about what Israel does, right? But preemptively, the preemptive strike that Israel undertakes in Iran, you can talk about the politics of it, the timing of it, but it's basically fair play, right? He's like, yes. America has different questions about what it might choose to do, but just lean into the embrace of that possibility. And I've been trying to do that. Wow, that's an unbelievable story. And with that, to bring a sense of agency and responsibility that maybe I, as a warrior, as opposed to a warrior, can't force the hand of my fellow Jewish people to consider, but can at least advance a Torah of that is going to force them to reckon with. The recognition of one of these stories makes visible the obligation of the second. And I guess the second big takeaway for me is sometimes, and this is also a way of rescuing myself from the feeling that history feels like it is washing over us, is sometimes the willingness to say that maybe the story isn't actually entirely about us. How much of this is about geopolitical change? How much about, it's like the Jewish community is doing a very, very bad job at fighting anti-Semitism, but we're not really responsible for it because we didn't invent anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites invented anti-Semitism, and it's very annoying that we have to fix that problem for them. So I'm very irritated by our incapacity to deal with that problem, but also I'm like, wait, this is a bigger problem. This connects to larger trends of global polarization, of toxic partisanship in this country, and maybe I got to give myself a little bit of a break in having to feel that this entire story is about us. And here, the archetype of a Jew who is instructed to not always see the world as mediated. It's not just about you. My favorite Jewish text of all time, the 4th chapter of the book of Jonah. Jonah is convinced when God sends him to give the prophecy to the Ninevites that he is being punished by God. And he tries to avoid it at all costs, and he has good reason to. He's a loyal partisan of the Jewish people. If he gives the prophecy to Nineveh telling them to repent, then God is going to use the Ninevites as God's blunt instrument to destroy the Israelites. And Jonah's like, I don't want to be the guy who helps them. That seems terrible. And Jonah, as you know, tries to evade responsibility, gets on the boat, gets tossed off the boat, gets eaten by the fish, gets spit out by the fish, and then ultimately is like, I guess I'm going. And in the last chapter of the book of Jonah, which is a completely strange chapter, Jonah sits there, and Jonah is really Judaism's greatest whiner. Jonah has finished all of this and is sitting there lamenting, and he says, woe is me. Why is this happening to me? And then he asks for, God provides for him a tree with shelter, and now he's like really happy because not only he's still dealing with the problem of why is me, but now he's like, why is me, but at least I have the shade. And then God sends a tolad, a worm, to consume the tree. And then Jonah's like, oh, why is me? And also, why is it so hot? And God's lesson at the end of the book of Jonah is, Jonah, not everything is about you. You were a piece of my plan in the world. You were just an instrument to do something that wasn't about you. You thought you could single-handedly change the course of history. Give it a rest. So I know I'm telling two different stories here. One of reclaiming agency by seeing the lanes where it is possible, and the other is a little bit rahmanas on ourselves, a little bit of compassion on ourselves to recognize where the scope of change is actually possible in a world that has forces and features that may be beyond our control. David Hartman writes in his book, The God Who Hates Lies, that when you live as a Jew through history, you ultimately have a choice of which ethics you want to pursue, the ethics of description or the ethics of response. An ethics of description is fixated with the question of trying to explain why things happen in the world. Hartman argues you're going to hit a lot of dead ends. You're going to make unsustainable claims about God's actions in the world. You're going to make uncompelling arguments that are going to fall apart right away. Instead, the ethics of response doesn't ask, why do things happen? It says, what can I do in response? Let me be agnostic about why these things emerge. Let me ask what it means for me to be a Jew like this in this moment. I invite us to consider these two stories. One, let's figure out a way to be compassionate towards our own experiences of trauma and uncertainty, recognizing, number one, that they are there, listening for them, noticing it in our reactions, our responses to others, to our community. Decisions that we make as a Jewish community in a period of trauma are going to be bad long-term decisions about boundary drawing and line drawing and saying the wrong things, to listen for that trauma. The second is to give ourselves the space to know that sometimes we are Jonah, convinced that we are the main protagonists in a story where there are forces beyond us. And the third is an invitation back to agency. Things are going to slow down. They seem to be slowing down already, but even the slowing down is happening too fast. I was not, right? I heard an amazing line from an Israeli friend of mine yesterday, which was, you know the phrase Isru Chag? It's the word, it means the day after a Jewish holiday, and it has kind of like, it's supposed to be like an adaptation day, and a person said, can we have an Isru war? Can we have because immediately the ceasefire started, and Israel announced that schools were open the following morning. It's like a little bit too much, but it doesn't have to be that fast, but this is a moment to also listen for the possibility of a reclamation of agency. It is ultimately the way in which the Jewish people can navigate history. Thank you very much. Sure, happy to take some questions.
I'd like your thoughts on the notion that we are Americans and we are Jews, and Israelis are Israelis and they are Jews.
Some of them, yeah.
And in discussing the question of agency and action, we are not there. We're here. The protection of democracy in America is very important, as are our commitments to Jews. And because I think the part of the question that you're posing, which is, thank you very much, your talk was fantastic. The element I think that needs to be developed a little more is, what do we do as Americans who also care deeply about Israel, but also our own country, and how do we because we are not them.
Yeah. Look, one of the ways that I think about this a lot, because I'm invested in the two projects that you're signaling. One is a collective Jewish project, right? But then there's also an independent political project that Jews are engaged with in these two places. I'm still invested that those political projects line up, right? I fear for when they don't line up. I think that's put to bed, by the way, right? When America literally finishes the job of Israel's war, it signals that these countries are still pretty well attached when it comes to policy. But I tend to lean more into the first question of what we share as Jews. And I do want to be clear that, like, part of the reason that that distinction matters is, like I said, 20+% of Israelis are not Jews. And so their story cannot be shaped entirely through the prism of Jewish ethics. That would be deeply anti-democratic. But where we have responsibility is that we are ultimately accountable to that same story of what is the moral, ethical character of who the Jewish people are in the world right now. And it might mean that sometimes we can carry water for their project, and sometimes they can carry water for our project. I want to find ways that this conversation that may be possible in a certain idiom and discourse here can sometimes happen in ways that Israelis can't fully be conversant with because of their situation, and that they may not be able to access a certain discourse because they have their own limitations, and there are pieces of what we can't fully understand because we're not living under those same circumstances. I want, ultimately, that the version that emerges out of this, a Torah of warriors and a Torah for warriors, are actually informing each other. I think there's something that we are capable of developing and understanding about the moral discourse of how a Jewish community experiences being a minority in the diaspora that is a vital piece of Torah for Israel to hold on to as it shapes its Jewish version of its domestic and foreign policies. And there are pieces of what Israel is forging in terms of a sovereign state that are really important for us to use as constraints and as shapers of how we think about what Jewish ethics ultimately mean. In some ways, it's very crude, but if I take those two ethical principles, the right of dignity and self-defense, and the right of the moral obligation to others, we're off a little bit. Israelis lean more into one, diaspora Jews lean more into the other. We create a comprehensive Jewish ethics when we manage to make those conversations conversant with each other. And in that sense, I'm interested for this conversation in what is the ultimate shared Torah of the Jewish people from this moment, more than I'm particularly interested in the question of what that means for the particular public policies that these two countries are going to play out. Hope that's okay.
Thank you very much. I think constructive optimism is a great formulation. I would be happy to embrace it.
But I think the discussion would benefit if it were a little bit more explicit about the concrete moral problems that we're facing. Just in the past 24 hours, there was an episode in which Jewish extremists attacked an Arab village, ignited cars, so on. This is something that seems to happen almost every day. Almost never are the offenders apprehended or punished. In the last 12-day war, Arab villages, Bedouin encampments have been forced to endure without bomb shelters, which the government has not provided to them. There are cases in which Arab citizens approached Jewish bomb shelters in Jewish cities, and they were told, no, you're not welcome here. These are the kinds of concrete ethical problems that somehow we need to deal with. We need to bring our agency to bear. Maybe that agency means helping to purchase shelters for those who have been deprived of them. We read in the Torah, Chukah Achat, for Israel, for Yisrael, and for the Ger. As far as I can tell, the only political entity in Israel that actually believes that in a concrete way is the Israeli Communist Party. Nobody else really thinks that there should be one law for Jews and Arabs that is equally applied. That's, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that is the kind of issue that I think we need to grapple with as explicitly as possible. Thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate your talk.
I 100% agree with you. Listen, the podcast that we released last week about reflections on this war, where I amplified the voices of 7 of my Israeli colleagues, actually 6 of them Israeli, 1 who's American who happened to be living in Israel throughout the year. Each of them told really powerful stories that ranged between the personal of the experience of being in a shelter to a more policy experience and policy orientation. And it was very jarring for me, but it felt like they were a way of thinking about these as holistic commitments rather than opposing positions. To hear my colleague Shraga Bar-On talk about the sheer sense of pride and optimism he has for the future of Israel, together with my colleague Rana Fahum talking about the deep inequalities that the bombing from Iran exposed in Israeli society, which is, by the way, an example of like the original version of intersectionality. Because Israelis are being oppressed by ballistic missiles, but Palestinian citizens of Israel who don't have shelters are now doubly oppressed. It's an intersectional oppression. And I want us, as our form of ethics, actually is the responsibility to do that parallel listening. I can hear both of those stories. I don't feel that one undermines the other. It's shocking to me how many Jews who take pro-Israel positions can't articulate both of those things out of their mouth at the same time. Why not? One of them I take pride in, the other obligates me. Those are the twin sides of what it means to be a religious human being. It's the twin sides of what it means to be an ethical human being. If every relationship you have to something obligates you, it's very hard to have a relationship with that or with yourself. That's when people give too much. If everything is about you and your sense of pride in your accomplishments, who the heck are you? So we have to be both. Zionism has to be both. That's the story that we have to create. And you're right to make this much more concrete. And needless to say, everything you said, but on steroids as it comes to Gaza.
Hi, that's a wonderful talk. I want to see if putting this in a slightly different vocabulary will add anything. I'm not sure it does, but one of the ways I've seen this discussed before all this started happening, say 10, 15 years ago, is you'd often hear people say, it's not so much that we don't have a Torah of war as that, Jews, for all these years, we don't really have a Torah of sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Of, we've our Talmud, our case law reflects our centuries of various kinds of experiences, but not of operating countries and nations and empires. If contrasting it to what the case law probably is over in the Muslim legal
Right.
system, where they have that experience. Maybe war's not the best time to develop a case law of power. How do you see that filling in the gap? I mean, in some ways, American Jews are more familiar with that because we have a secular case law of sovereignty and of self-governance. How do Jews get to that kind of case law of Torah?
Look, I think it is building. I think this is a different conversation than it was 20 years ago. What I indicated about the democracy movement, about the religious pluralism movement in Israel, these are not the same conversations that they once were. And there is now, case law. There's a huge consensus on the shift towards religious pluralism as state policy in Israel, which is basically held captive to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's been the case for a long time. And to kind of foreign policy is sublimating the capacity to build a mass coalition that believes in the legitimacy of marriage, divorce, and death for all Jews within the state of Israel, according to the way that they want to get married, get divorced, or die, right? That's pretty widespread. So the case law is there. The case law about the way in which war was waged for a long time has been growing. But it's true. War has a suspending effect to the capacity to turn that into that Torah. So what I'm saying is if we are emerging from this, that is going to feel like one of the moral set of responsibilities here, not the Torah of self-pride and self-accomplishment, but what do we learn about our capacity, and therefore what do we learn about our responsibility? That to me feels like the big Torah move that comes out of this. If the state of Israel is capable of reshaping its story in the region the way that it wants to, why isn't it applying that to the other areas of its destiny where it could also shape that story in a morally responsible way?
Thank you again for being here. This question is going to reflect what you said at the beginning about we American Jews trying to figure out how we feel about all these things and whether they're good and whether they're bad that are going on in Israel. And something you said toward the end there were a few things. One was about the means and the ends and mixing those up. The other was about how, based on as I interpreted it, based on the U.S. finishing the job in Iran, that somehow it shows that we're much more connected, government and government, than some would believe. And some of the confusion is I'm not so sure about that because, as you mentioned, the constitutionality and the not consulting with Congress, the actions that the U.S. took may have just been the thinking of one person, emotionally or otherwise, which is part of the confusion of how should I feel as an American Jew who's a Zionist, but who doesn't really know what is motivating the move for the U.S. to support Israel there. I'm also thinking back to when you were here in November and you were talking about the differences between Israeli liberal Zionism and American or the diaspora liberal Zionism, and how they don't have to be the same, but they need to work together. And so here I am thinking, if Israel decided, and the government that they elected decided to go and bomb Iran, we can have an opinion, I can have an opinion, but it's not our decision. But we have influence and we have an interest and an agency in what our government does. And I find myself totally confused on the one hand, I feel relief in some way about what happened in Iran, and on the other hand, I'm not sure if all of my concern and worrying is only about the US and its democracy, or if it's about Israel and the world, because I'm not so sure that what the US has done is actually in the best interests of Israel. So What do you say?
Yeah, welcome. Welcome. I would say, I guess what I would say is, how important is it to you to resolve those questions immediately? Because by the way, it's very reasonable to say, I need to know what to think now, maybe because I gotta give a sermon on it, or because I want to fall asleep tonight. It's understandable, right, to be able to formulate that. As I said earlier, I'm not sure how easy it is for us to all do that, especially with what we have access to in terms of information about all these things and what is obscured from us. I think there is one just self-care habit we can undertake, which is a little bit of like, I don't know how I feel about this, but let me wait for more information and form an opinion that's developed over time, which is probably going to have greater staying power than the decision to commit to an opinion early in the process, because of all of the reasons it makes us feel warm and fuzzy, to feel certain that we know something about something. And that's frustrating, because if I don't know exactly what I think about it right now, then I'm unsettled with it. And because in our media culture and social media culture, there's a commodity on the hot take. Do you know exactly what to think now? But I don't know. Most of those hot takes wind up being pretty lukewarm. And I've been very anxious about podcasting for 2 weeks on this, because we have like a 48-hour turnaround time to produce a podcast. And I recorded that one with my dad about like what's going to be the future of American involvement. And then they bombed Iran. And we didn't know about it yet. So we were like, well, most of what we talked about was pretty good. But yesterday they were like, just re-record the intro slightly. Right? So maybe the place of wisdom in that place is not feeling that we're on the hook, whether we're content producers or just people, to feel we need to know. Maybe we have to figure out how to live with that. Yeah.
We'll take one more question.
So thank you very much, first of all. Your story at the end of Jonah, and that it's not all about him, was very striking to me, because it does feel to me that in the vision that you've proposed, the sort of the group that may pose problems, I think within both the American Jewish community and in the Israeli Jewish community, there is a segment that does believe that in fact everything is all about Jews, and the future of the world is all about Jews, and the ultimate vision of what will be is about Jews. So how, and they are a substantial portion both in terms of birth rate in America as well as in Israel, and in terms of support for Israel. And where does that fit into the picture? Because I'm not sure about the openness to seeing something, to having a different vision.
I couldn't quite tell if when you were listing that you were talking about anti-Semites, but I don't think
No.
You're talking about Jews.
No, I'm talking about Jews.
Isn't it funny that those are...
I am talking about Jews, although I don't want to rule out perhaps, fundamentalist Christians who see us as being integral to maybe the second coming. But no, I'm talking about Jews for whom, in fact, I think the world does revolve around Jews and Judaism. Their vision of what messianic or pre-messianic or whatever it is, the ultimate view is that we are what counts in the world, more than anything else and anyone else.
Look, the comment about anti-Semites is not flipped, because it's also not just on the right. Left anti-Semitism is that starts from anti-Zionism is premised on the same question, which is the Jews and the state of Israel are the kind of global referendum for morality. So that becomes the primary index by which to view issues like genocide and oppression happens through the state of Israel. It's not a coincidence. There's more to say about that, especially when it comes around Europeans. But it's true, it does come in from the Jewish community, and it reminds us that actually like extreme chosenness and anti-Semitism are the flip side of the same coin. They are, I think the world revolves around you and I think you're bad, versus I think the world revolves around me and I think I'm good. They're in some ways inverse of the same thing. The vast majority of Jews don't hold to that viewpoint. It may be changing demographics, but it's not. And there's no reason for a population that is a majority viewpoint among Jews to act as though it is a beleaguered minority. It just needs to be more clear about the complexity of our moral commitments as Jews and more passionate advocates for those positions in public. The reason why the extremist viewpoints feel that they get more airtime is because it's always the case that narrow fundamentalist ideologies can express themselves very simply and very succinctly. They're bumper stickerable. They make for better Jewish songs for weddings, right? That's just easier. So this is like, we don't have a substance problem in liberal Judaism. We don't. We have branding problems, that's for sure. But I don't mean that in a flip way. It's not just the whole Israel just needs better Hasbara. That's not what I'm talking about. It's actually being able to articulate these as commitments that we take as seriously as fundamentalists take their commitments. As opposed to saying, because these are not fundamentalist commitments, we treat them as though they're light commitments, that we don't care about them as deeply. And that's the place where I think we have to get to work. Thank you, everybody. That was helpful.